On a rain-heavy evening in Boston, spring of 2018, Daniel Kessler never came home. His apartment lights burned all night, a dinner plate untouched, and 2 passports lay side by side on the kitchen counter. Neighbors assumed a late shift, maybe a sudden trip. By morning, silence held, and his sister reported him missing. Detectives found gaps in the building's cameras, unexplained transfers in his bank record, and colleagues who whispered about secret work. The search faded, the case grew cold. Yet in 2021, a sealed envelope surfaced in an evidence vault. Inside, a photograph of Daniel, taken 2 years after he vanished, standing in a foreign train station with a woman no one could name. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The call came just after 7 p.m., late enough that the sun had slipped behind Boston's row houses and left the sky a pale indigo. Detective Evan Rourke stood in the narrow stairwell of a brick apartment building in the South End, listening to the muffled voice of the building manager. A tenant had not been seen since yesterday morning. His lights were still burning, his door locked from the outside. The sister had phoned it in, worried enough to override embarrassment. Missing persons at this hour often began with the mundane, an overnight trip, a forgotten call. Yet when Rourke stepped into the apartment, the air felt wrong. The kitchen light buzzed with a steady hum. A plate sat on the table, fork untouched, a glass of water half gone. Near the counter, a jacket hung as if abandoned mid-motion. What caught him first was the faint smell of ironed fabric, the sterile odor of clothes pressed but never worn. On the counter, flat against the laminate, 2 passports waited. Both were American. Both showed the same face. The names did not match. Daniel Kessler was 34, a man of orderly habits, according to his sister. He worked between the university's data lab and a consultancy, kept his rent paid, his utilities steady. The room confirmed her portrait. Shelves stacked with books in tidy rows, receipts pinned under a magnet, bills cleared in neat cycles. The kitchen clock ticked with measured indifference. Nothing had been taken, except the man himself. Rourke moved carefully, marking details with the deliberate pace that came from years of procedure. The apartment door's electronic entry log showed one final use at 4 p.m. on the day of disappearance. No exit recorded after. That detail would matter later, but for now it lingered like a whisper. On the wall, just by the doorframe, a small brass key hung from a hook. No tag, no label. Plain, domestic, unremarkable. He slid it into an evidence pouch, though he did not yet know why. Neighbors leaned in the hallway as officers passed. Mrs. Howell from across the landing said she had last seen Daniel at noon, carrying groceries in a canvas bag. Another resident claimed a sighting at 10:03 p.m., though his voice wavered, uncertain of the day. The building's cameras offered little. One unit had frozen for 8 minutes, leaving a gap that swallowed Daniel's final steps. The silence of that gap pressed more heavily than the buzzing kitchen light. Marianne Kessler arrived with her coat still damp from the evening rain. She carried herself in a manner both rigid and breaking, hands folded tightly at her stomach. She told Rourke that Daniel had no reason to leave, no debt she knew of, no sudden travel. He was steady, almost dull in his routines, and that steadiness had always been her comfort. She paused at the sight of the 2 passports, color draining from her face. She insisted her brother had only one. Photographs were taken, the room documented, every drawer opened and closed under gloves. The bathroom was ordinary, the bedroom bed neatly made. On the desk sat a small black notebook, but its pages were blank, unused. The only irregularity in the room's rhythm was the double identity laid bare on the counter. One passport bore the name Daniel Kessler, issued in Boston. The other read David Kane, issued in Washington, with stamps showing travel no family had mentioned. Both photographs captured the same angular face, same cropped dark hair, same steady eyes. Forensics moved through, careful to leave the room unbroken. They noted no signs of forced entry, no overturned chair, no struggle. Dust on the windowsills lay undisturbed. The clock ticked past 9 p.m. as Rourke stood again at the table, staring at the passports. He had seen counterfeit documents before, but these were crisp, official, and real. Too real to dismiss as forgery. The brass key, now sealed in plastic, weighed faintly in his pocket. He found himself glancing at it more than the passports. Something about its presence, quiet, unnecessary, suspended by a hook, felt less like a household spare and more like a marker. The apartment was silent but for the hum of the light. Marianne lingered at the doorway, unwilling to step farther in. Her eyes fixed on her brother's jacket slumped across the chair, as though he might return and shrug into it again. She asked when she would hear back, when someone would call her with news. Rourke gave the answer he always gave: soon. But the unease in his voice betrayed him. Officers moved out, leaving the space still, but not empty. Rourke's last act was to slide the passports into separate bags, logged under distinct tags, as if they belonged to two men who had shared the same face. The lights were shut off. The room folded back into darkness, yet the questions remained, waiting, silent, heavier than the night. 2 passports on the table, both bearing his face. Morning came with a thin mist curling along the Charles River, a softness that did little to disguise the chill in Boston streets. Detective Rourke stood in the narrow courtyard behind the apartment building, coffee cooling in his hand as the crime scene tape fluttered. The first day after a disappearance was often full of noise, calls, interviews, forms, but here the silence carried weight. The building's residents filed in and out under watchful eyes. Most had little to offer beyond sympathy, yet a few details surfaced. Leonard Pike, retired and prone to standing by his window at odd hours, swore he had seen Daniel step out around 10:3 p.m. the night he vanished. The man wore a dark overcoat Leonard didn't recognize, longer than his usual, and carried no bag. Leonard admitted he couldn't be certain of the day, but the memory clung to him all the same. Clarissa Vale, the night security guard, kept meticulous logs. Her record showed Daniel entering at 4 p.m., as the door's electronic lock confirmed. But there was no log of him leaving. When pressed, she shook her head, repeating that the system never missed a swipe. Still, the footage from the lobby told a different story. At least it should have. The digital file cut out at 10:03 p.m., resuming 8 minutes later with nothing unusual. No error message, no recorded explanation, just absence. In the detective's report, this absence read like a wound. He logged it, noted the gap, and wondered who had the access to carve time away from a camera. Inside the apartment again, he turned his attention to the brass key. It lay sealed in its pouch on his desk, unremarkable, its grooves ordinary. But the choice to hang it by the door, without a label, still unsettled him. He photographed it against the light, then placed it in the evidence cabinet, a line in a growing ledger. Marianne returned that afternoon. She brought old photographs, flipping them across the table with a kind of mechanical urgency. Daniel at the university, Daniel in front of Fenway Park, Daniel on a family trip years before. In every photo, his jacket was the same, short, plain, worn with habit. Not once had she seen the overcoat Pike described. She refused to believe her brother owned it. When shown the 2 passports, she pressed her hands together so tightly that her knuckles whitened. "He never had this name," she whispered, pointing to David Kane. "Never." Her voice carried the weight of someone who needed certainty, even as the paper betrayed her. Forensics had little else to offer. No fingerprints beyond Daniel's and his sister's from recent visits. No signs of forced locks, no foreign fibers in the carpets. The only anomaly remained the electronic door log and the cameras. The building's management insisted no one tampered with the system, yet the data said otherwise. By evening, rain swept across the city. Rourke drove slowly along Tremont Street, headlights glistening off slick asphalt, the image of the empty footage replaying in his mind. He filed the day's report with deliberate precision, closing his notes with the words, "Subject sighted at 10:03 p.m. by resident witness. No corroboration. Surveillance gap unexplained. Possible alternate coat not recovered." The apartment above remained sealed, its silence broken only by the faint buzz of electric lights that no one had thought to turn off. The footage ends where the street should have begun. Rain softened to drizzle the next morning, leaving Boston glazed in silver light. Detective Rourke sat in his office, sleeves rolled, staring at the 2 passports laid open on his desk. They were official, both genuine, the seals embossed, the fibers correct. Daniel Kessler on one, David Kane on the other. Same photograph, same faint scar at the jawline. 1 life, 2 names. He pushed them aside and turned to the financial records. Bank statements arrived overnight from a court order rushed through. Most pages looked routine: rent payments, grocery stores, utility bills. Then, 3 months before the disappearance, something shifted. Wire transfers began arriving from an account registered in Luxembourg. Always the same amount, $5,000. Each transaction left Daniel's balance untouched for weeks, then withdrawn in cash. No explanation, no employer listed. The second passport explained itself further. Stamps told a story the family had never heard. Madrid, spring of 2016. Zurich, autumn the same year. Lisbon, briefly, before returning to Logan Airport. Marianne insisted Daniel never traveled abroad, not even once. Yet the pages said otherwise, stamped in orderly ink. Rourke placed the brass key beside the documents, a quiet witness. Its plain surface reflected the desk lamp, the grooves cutting shadows. On impulse, he photographed the passport stamps with the key beside them. The juxtaposition felt strange, as if the key belonged to this second life more than the first. He called in Sylvia Heller, a retired federal agent who occasionally consulted on cases with foreign traces. She arrived with a scarf wound tight against the morning chill, her movements deliberate. She flipped through the passports, her fingertip pausing on the Madrid entry. "This stamp is genuine," she murmured. "But there's no corresponding entry in the Department of Homeland Security logs. If he left, it wasn't through the front door." Rourke raised an eyebrow. Meaning someone cleared him another way. Either his papers ran deeper than we think, or someone scrubbed the records after the fact. The idea sat heavy between them. Ordinary men didn't bypass border logs. At the university, Rourke questioned Fiona Madsen, a colleague from the data lab. She described Daniel as polite but distant, always carrying a black notebook. He kept it close, never leaving it unattended. She thought it contained notes for his projects, yet she had never seen him open it in public. When shown the blank notebook from his apartment, she frowned. "That's not the one he carried," she said. "His was worn, edges curled, cover cracked." Another absence, another hollow echo. Back at the apartment building, Rourke stood once more in the hallway. The neighbors grew restless with police presence, avoiding questions. Yet one detail surfaced from a delivery driver. 3 days before the disappearance, a package had been left for Daniel, heavy, wrapped in brown paper, collected by him personally. No record of its sender existed in the building log. The drizzle lifted into a pale afternoon. Rourke wrote his notes at the station, the desk lamp reflecting off the sealed pouch that held the brass key. His report marked the financial anomalies, the unexplained travel, the missing notebook, the unlogged package. Threads without knots, each fraying into the next. Marianne called that evening, her voice tight with fatigue. She had searched her brother's drawers, old boxes from their parents' house. In one, she found a postcard from Madrid, unsigned, postmarked 2 years earlier. On the back, a single sketch, the outline of a key, small and ordinary, like the brass one sealed away. She sent a photograph to Rourke, who pinned it on the evidence board. The image stared back at him, absurd in its simplicity, yet undeniable. The case widened, yet no body appeared. No witness came forward. The city carried on under evening lights, but the investigation pressed into shadows. An unexplained stamp, Madrid, 2 years unaccounted for. The 4th day carried with it a crisp cold, the kind that sharpened the skyline into clean lines. Detective Rourke walked the length of Massachusetts Avenue, the sound of traffic dull behind his thoughts. He was headed toward the consultancy where Daniel had taken a second contract, an arrangement the sister hadn't known about until the paperwork turned up in financial checks. The office was a converted warehouse, now lined with glass walls and quiet desks. Inside, he was met by Victor Brandt, the director, his handshake firm but eyes cautious. Brandt confirmed Daniel's role, a data analyst, contracted part-time, mostly remote. Reliable, he said. Delivered on schedule, quiet to himself. Brandt emphasized nothing unusual, but Rourke noticed the pause when he asked whether Daniel had clearance for certain restricted data sets. That hesitation told its own story. The consultancy held contracts with a larger technology company connected to defense logistics. Rourke wasn't naive. Sensitive work often blurred into classified territory. He requested Daniel's workspace. It was a small cubicle, stripped clean except for a stack of outdated journals and a pen holder. On the lowest shelf sat a slim leather-bound notebook, black, edges worn. The notebook was filled, page after page of tight handwriting. At first glance, the text resembled ordinary notes, numbers, dates, shorthand sketches. But woven into the margins were small symbols, geometric shapes repeating at intervals, squares bisected by lines, circles enclosing dots, and in several places, a tiny drawing of a brass key. Always the same, always placed at the end of a sequence. Rourke flipped through carefully, gloves on, photographing the pages. He could not make sense of the markings, but the rhythm felt deliberate, like a code only its owner could read. Later, in the dim light of his office, he compared the notebook's drawings to the postcard Marianne had found. The match was undeniable. The same key, sketched in the same blunt outline. What was once a household object now threaded through every fragment of Daniel's hidden life. He called in Jared Yo, the company's systems administrator, who had worked near Daniel. Jared was young, jittery, his fingers restless as he spoke. He admitted Daniel logged in late at night, often between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. He said he liked quiet servers, Jared explained. But the logs told more. Daniel accessed files he shouldn't have touched, databases tied to overseas procurement contracts. When confronted, Jared hesitated, then said, "I didn't report it. He told me not to. Said it was already cleared." Rourke pressed for details, but Jared retreated into nervous silence. A formal request to the company was already in motion. What mattered for now was that Daniel had moved beyond ordinary consultancy. In the evening, Rourke met with Marianne again. He laid the notebook on the table between them, its pages open to the key symbols. Her face tightened. "He drew that as a child," she whispered. She described how, when nervous, Daniel would doodle the same image, a key, plain and unadorned. No one in the family knew why. It was a quirk, dismissed as harmless. Now it had followed him into adulthood, carried into hidden work and second identities. Sylvia Heller studied the notebook under her lamp, eyes narrowing. "Tradecraft," she said softly. "Ciphers layered into ordinary text. The key may be literal or just a marker. Either way, he was encoding something." The words echoed in Rourke's thoughts long after he left her office. The brass key, once nothing, was now both symbol and artifact. It appeared on a postcard from Madrid, in a work notebook, in sketches, and hung in brass on his apartment wall. Its meaning lay just out of reach, like a door unopened. As the night drew down, the city's lights blurred across rain-slicked streets. Rourke sat in his car outside the apartment building, notebook on the passenger seat. He thought of the surveillance gap, the overcoat Leonard Pike described, the Luxembourg transfers, and the stamps in the passport. A man's life had unfolded in duplicate, one version visible, another hidden beneath. In his official report, he wrote, "Recovered secondary notebook. Contains symbols recurring with brass key motif. Notation indicates possible cipher. Access data beyond contractual clearance. Connections unresolved." He closed the file and turned off the desk lamp. Yet the sketches lingered, etched in his vision. A key drawn over and over, a promise of something locked and waiting. Symbols repeating, drawn like maps, ending at a key. The morning broke gray, the air heavy with damp fog pressing against Boston's skyline. Detective Rourke drove north toward Cambridge, guided by the smallest of threads. Leonard Pike's statement about the long dark overcoat had refused to leave his mind. The apartment search had uncovered no such garment. Daniel's closets were stripped to routine shirts, jackets, and winter coats. Nothing matched Pike's description. If the man was right, then Daniel, or someone resembling him, had worn something he had no reason to own. The lead pointed to a modest clothing store tucked on a side street, the kind of shop that sold sturdy coats in limited stock. The proprietor, Elias Dorn, was an elderly man with sharp memory. He remembered selling a dark wool overcoat 5 days before Daniel's disappearance. "Tall fellow, sharp features," Dorn said. "Paid cash, exact change. Strange thing was, he asked no questions, didn't even try it on." Rourke laid down the passport photograph of Daniel Kessler. Dorn adjusted his glasses, studying it with narrowed eyes. "Yes," he said finally. "That's him, or nearly him. The voice was different, accent faint, hard to place, but the face, yes, the face was his." The receipt was still kept in Dorn's order book, a small square of paper torn from the ledger. Date: 3 days before Daniel vanished. Time: 4:15 p.m. Paid in full, no name recorded. The record was clear enough to lock the purchase into place. Rourke photographed the receipt and sealed it. In the surveillance still from Dorn's own old camera, the figure appeared briefly, blurry, tilted by the angle, but undeniably familiar. The man stood by the counter, hand hovering near a brass key lying in the open register tray. The coincidence struck like a blow. Another echo of the same object, the key returning in places it had no reason to be. Driving back through the fog, Rourke replayed Dorn's words. Not quite his voice. What did that mean? A twin? An imitator? Or simply Daniel slipping into another identity? The 2 passports hinted at duplication. Perhaps the overcoat was a uniform of sorts, worn only when stepping into the shadow life. At headquarters, the evidence board grew crowded. Photographs of the passports, the postcard sketch, the notebook symbols, and now the receipt from Dorn's ledger. Each pinned line intersected at the brass key taped firmly at the center. A trivial household object had become the axis of an investigation. Marianne visited again in the afternoon. She listened as Rourke described the overcoat purchase, the receipt, the voice that was not quite right. Her response was sharp, almost desperate. "Daniel never owned anything like that. If someone wore it, it wasn't him." She pressed her palm to the table, eyes flashing with something between anger and fear. The detective did not argue. He simply noted her conviction. Families often clung to certainty even as the evidence suggested fracture. Still, her insistence left a mark. By late day, rain returned, sweeping against the precinct windows. Rourke filed his report. Overcoat acquired by subject or lookalike 3 days prior to disappearance. Paid in cash. Witness confirms resemblance, voice inconsistent. Possible disguise or identity shift. He paused at the last line, wondering whether to write identity theft instead of identity shift. But the presence of 2 authentic passports made theft unlikely. This was construction, not imitation. As night closed in, Rourke sat alone in the dim of his office. The brass key's outline glowed faintly through its evidence pouch under lamplight. He studied its grooves, unremarkable yet insistent. He imagined turning it in some unseen lock, opening a door that would explain everything. The case had moved from absence into duplication. Daniel Kessler's life was not stolen. It had been split. Which version of him had walked out in that long, dark coat? And where had he gone? A coat bought for cash, voice not quite his. Cold wind swept across the city the next day, bending the traffic lights along Tremont Street. Detective Rourke carried the weight of new subpoenas in his coat pocket. They granted him access to Daniel's secondary employment files at the consultancy, the work that had already raised questions. Inside the company's server room, humming with fluorescent light, he met again with systems administrator Jared Yo. Jared had pulled login records, reluctant but bound by order. The data showed Daniel accessing project files far beyond his clearance. Defense procurement spreadsheets, encrypted routing tables, communications flagged with government seals. His entries always came late at night, 11:40 p.m., 12:05 a.m., 1:17 a.m., timed when oversight thinned. Could be a mistake, Jared offered, eyes darting. Sometimes the system route's wrong. Yet when Rourke pressed him, he admitted Daniel's credentials had been used with a secondary authentication key. He must have had access, Jared whispered. Someone gave it to him. The logs carried one more detail. The last successful login came the night before Daniel vanished. At 1:32 a.m., his account accessed a restricted archive, then severed connection. Minutes later, the account was deactivated from within. No trace remained. It was as if his digital life had folded shut. Rourke stepped into Victor Brandt's office with the findings. Brandt shifted behind his desk, the view of the harbor framed cold behind him. He denied knowledge, insisted Daniel's role was minor, administrative at best. Yet his hand tapped a restless rhythm on the desk as he spoke, betraying the strain of denial. If he accessed more, Brandt said, then he did it without my knowledge. We'll cooperate. His tone was measured, but his eyes carried calculation. Rourke noted it all, though he knew cooperation had limits. The consultancy's contracts touched too closely on government supply chains. The deeper he pushed, the more likely the investigation would vanish into sealed corridors. That evening, he spread documents across his desk, arranging them like fragments of a puzzle. At the center, he placed the brass key, its pouch catching the lamplight. He thought of the drawings in Daniel's notebook, the postcard sketch, the blurred photo in Dorn's store. The key was not random. It recurred like a cipher, a mark left behind. Sylvia Heller visited, leaning on her cane, the years of fieldwork still alive in her careful eye. She studied the login records, lips pressing thin. These times, she said, pointing to the late-night entries, are classic. Quiet hours, fewer eyes, fewer questions. He wasn't stealing at random. He was pulling something specific. And the key? Rourke asked. Sylvia turned the pouch slowly in her hands. Could be literal. Could be signal. In tradecraft, objects repeat. A doodle, a trinket, a code word. It threads the story together. He marked his work with this key. The question is whether he left it for us or for them. Outside, rain washed across the glass. The room smelled faintly of dust and wet paper. Marianne had dropped off a box of her brother's old belongings earlier. School papers, report cards, letters from their parents. In one notebook from his teenage years, she had flagged a page, a rough sketch of a brass key, identical to the one scattered across his adult life. It unsettled Rourke more than he expected. The image had followed Daniel for decades, as if he had been rehearsing for a role long before he stepped onto the stage. Near midnight, Rourke drove past the river, headlights streaking against the dark water. His notes were filed but incomplete. Subject accessed restricted archives. Credentials indicate inside assistance. Last login terminated abruptly. Physical symbol, brass key, present across multiple contexts. Interpretation unclear. He shut the notebook, but the lines did not leave him. In his mind, the grooves of the key deepened, as though each unanswered question had been cut into metal. Access logs vanished the moment his account goes dark. The week edged forward under low skies. Detective Rourke returned to the precinct one afternoon to find a plain envelope waiting on his desk. No postage, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. It contained nothing but a photocopy of the brass key, its outline stark against the pale background. No message, no fingerprints except a smudge that lab techs later confirmed belonged to no one in their database. Rourke called Marianne that evening. Her voice cracked when she heard. "Someone's taunting us," she said. But Rourke wasn't certain. A copy of the key had meaning. It suggested intention, a reminder that the missing man was still tethered to someone's hand. The precinct logged the envelope, sealed it, filed it. But the gesture stuck in Rourke's mind long after. Whoever had left it knew where to reach him. Days later, a man introduced himself to Marianne outside her workplace. He gave only a first name, Adrian. He claimed to have known Daniel years before, back when he worked briefly at a research library. His manner was calm, deliberate, too smooth. He told her not to worry. that Daniel was alive. When she pressed for details, he handed her another envelope and walked away without looking back. Inside was a photograph, blurred but unmistakable. Daniel, seated at a cafe table that did not belong to Boston. The background showed signage in French, the light harsh with Mediterranean sun. Across the table sat a woman, her face turned away. The date printed along the edge placed it 7 months after his disappearance. Rourke studied the image under magnification. No manipulation showed, no forgery lines. Lab confirmed the paper stock matched prints available in Europe. The smudge of shadow on the woman's cheek remained unreadable. The brass key lingered again in the story. At the corner of the photograph, just visible on the cafe table, lay a small object. Metallic, gleaming. Rourke enlarged the image. It was no larger than a thumb, but its grooves matched what he already knew. The same key, once more. The detective carried the photograph to Sylvia Heller. She studied it for a long time, tapping her cane against the floor. "He's not missing," she said finally. "He's moving. The question is whether he's free." Rourke filed the report with caution. Anonymous contact provided photograph of subject alive post-disappearance. Location unknown. Signage indicates French language region. Object resembling brass key visible. Contact identified only as Adrian. No further trace. Marianne grew restless. She demanded answers, demanded movement. Rourke told her only what procedure allowed, but the photograph pressed against both of them. The certainty of Daniel's presence elsewhere shifted the case from absence into shadow pursuit. That night, rain slicked the city. Rourke sat in his office, the photocopy of the key pinned beside the photograph. 2 echoes of the same object, one left by a stranger, the other caught in candid moment. The brass key had stopped being coincidence. It was message, signature, or both. When he left for the night, the hallway light flickered, and the image of that key lingered in his vision, grooves etched deeper than before. A copy key arrives with no name, no note. A lead surfaced 3 mornings later. Records from a rental agency in East Boston flagged a lease under the name David Kane. The second identity carried in Daniel's other passport. The apartment was modest, a second-floor walk-up above a shuttered tailor shop. From the outside, it looked deserted. Curtains drawn, mailbox stuffed with circulars. Rourke signed the warrant and stepped inside with Sylvia and 2 uniformed officers. The air was stale, heavy with dust. Furniture was sparse. A single cot, a folding table, 2 metal chairs. On the wall above the table hung a corkboard, stripped bare except for pinholes and faded tape marks. The room spoke of transience, not home. Yet in the corner, rolled against the baseboard, lay a large map of Boston. They unrolled it across the table. Red ink traced certain streets, a web of lines stretching from the waterfront inward. Dots marked several intersections. One line arced across the Charles River and stopped abruptly at a block near South Station. Thread fragments clung to the map's edges, fibers consistent with tailoring chalk, according to the quick glance of the forensics tech. Near the window, a shallow drawer held only scraps. Receipts from corner stores? A bus ticket to Logan Airport never used, and in the bottom, a thin strip of metal shaved from a key blank. It was smooth, polished, discarded. Another echo. Rourke slid the brass key from his evidence pouch and tried it on the apartment door. It turned cleanly. The cylinder gave with a click. This was its home. The key on Daniel's wall, unmarked and unexplained, matched this hidden life perfectly. Marianne stood outside when the search ended. She refused to step into the apartment, gripping her coat against the wind. "This isn't him," she said. "He wouldn't keep another place." Her words trembled, caught between denial and dread. Rourke did not argue. The evidence said otherwise. The forensics team bagged the receipts, the bus ticket, the map. The map's red lines were photographed in detail, each mark cross-checked against city blocks. Most sites meant nothing. Quiet streets, closed warehouses, ordinary intersections. But one dot rested directly over the consultancy's office building. Another marked the library where Daniel had once worked. A third circled the very apartment from which he had vanished, patterns layered on patterns. The key opened the door, the map traced his paths, the receipts placed him in this shadow life. And yet no one could say where he had gone when the door shut behind him. That evening, Rourke pinned the enlarged map to the evidence board. Red lines glowed under lamplight, their intersections sharp as wounds. He placed the brass key at the center, the grooves aligning with one line like a compass needle. The case no longer spoke of simple disappearance, it spoke of design. In his report, he wrote, "Secondary residence identified under alias David Kane. Interior sparse, indicative of operational use. Map recovered with targeted locations. Receipts and transport stubs suggest staging. Brass key confirmed match to apartment lock." But in his own notes, unwritten in the file, he added, "If the key opens one door, how many more remain unseen?" The rain fell again that night, running down the precinct windows in long, narrow trails. The city pulsed beyond, unaware of the lines drawn across its streets. The key turns, but the rooms echo with nothing. The discovery of the East Boston apartment forced the case higher. By the next morning, federal agents joined the briefings, their suits and clipped language filling the precinct's narrow conference room. Detective Rourke sat at the far end of the table, the brass key bagged before him like an anchor. They brought files, some thick with red tape, others thin with deliberate omission. The message was clear. The disappearance was no longer a local matter. Agent Michael Trovick led the session, a man with pale eyes and precise diction. He laid down a folder and slid across several grainy photographs. Surveillance stills, dated summer 2017, captured near the Boston docks. One frame showed Daniel standing at the edge of a pier, hands in pockets, speaking with a woman whose face was half obscured by wind-blown hair. Another frame caught them walking away together. The timestamp placed it 9 months before his disappearance. Rourke studied the images. The woman was unfamiliar, her features blurred. Trovick spoke carefully. "We believe she was traveling under a French passport, though the name has not been verified. Records of her entry into the country are incomplete." The implications thickened. A second life was one thing. A second companion, hidden from family, was another. Rourke wondered whether Marianne had ever heard of her. He suspected not. Forensics added little. The surveillance negatives were degraded, stored poorly. The lab pulled what detail they could, sharpening edges, but the blur persisted. Daniel's profile was certain, the woman's less so. What unsettled Rourke was the faint glint near Daniel's belt. Magnified, it appeared metallic, oval, with a groove like a key ring. Later that day, Sylvia Heller reviewed the photographs with him. She tapped her finger against the blurred woman. "Not random," she said. "He wasn't drifting. Meetings at the docks mean trade. Information in, information out." Rourke frowned. "And the woman?" Sylvia leaned back. "If she traveled under French cover, she may not be French at all, but she is part of the same circle. And look here." She pointed at the faint glint. "Your key again. He carried it everywhere." That evening, Rourke visited Marianne. She sat rigid in her living room, a mug of tea untouched before her. When he showed her the dockside photographs, she shook her head violently. "No, she said. "That isn't him. That can't be him." Her denial cut through the quiet, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition she couldn't name. She stared at the woman in the picture, as if searching for a resemblance. Then she turned away. Back at the precinct, the evidence board grew denser. The apartment map, the postcard sketch, the notebook symbols, the receipt from Dorn's shop, and now the dockside photographs, all circled by the brass key pinned in the center. Each fragment returned to it, as if the object were less a tool than a cipher. The federal agents pressed forward, but they revealed little. They hinted at broader networks, at files still sealed, at surveillance that had run years before Daniel vanished. Rourke sensed the investigation slipping from his grasp, consumed by corridors he could not enter. Yet he held to the physical, the key in its pouch, the photographs pinned to the board, the receipts, the maps. Objects did not lie, even when reports did. That night, rain lashed the harbor. Rourke stood on the docks where Daniel had been photographed. The water slapped against pilings. The air smelled of rust and brine. He pictured the meeting, the exchange, the woman's face turned away. Somewhere in that silence, the trail bent, leading away from the city into darker channels. A blurred photograph, his face beside an unknown woman. The woman from the dockside photographs was given a name: Elena Varin. At least, that was the alias attached to the French passport flagged in the databases. The document was genuine but falsely acquired, built through layers of applications that folded back into nothing. By the time investigators followed the threads, they ended in agencies that no longer existed, offices closed a decade earlier. Detective Rourke read the report in silence, rain beating steady against the precinct's tall windows. Elena had entered the United States 3 times between 2015 and 2017. Each time her trail faded in Boston. The last record showed her departure at Logan Airport just hours before Daniel's disappearance. Though camera footage at the terminal revealed nothing of her boarding, Agent Travick outlined the working theory. Daniel and Elena had been partners of some kind. Whether in tradecraft, research, or something darker remained undefined. What mattered was that both had vanished in tandem. Rourke pressed for concrete ground. The brass key still waited in its pouch. He wanted doors, not theories. The break came from a property clerk cross-checking storage rentals. A unit in South Boston, rented 6 months earlier, listed under the same alias as Elena's passport. Payment had been made in cash. The lease signature bore handwriting that could not be matched to any known sample. By afternoon, the detective stood before a row of metal storage units, their corrugated doors streaked with rust. The wind funneled between them, carrying the smell of oil and rain. Officers cut the lock on the identified unit. The padlock fell heavy into Rourke's hand. He turned it, examining the grooves. The brass key fit perfectly, twisting with a soft click before the bolt surrendered. The door rolled up with a groan. Dust swirled in the light, disturbed for the first time in months. Inside, the space was sparse but deliberate. 2 metal shelves lined the walls. On them sat boxes, identical, stacked with military neatness. A folding chair rested in the corner, its seat clean, suggesting recent use. Rourke moved carefully, gloves snapping into place. The first box contained mundane household goods, blankets, dishes, a lamp. But beneath the top layer, an envelope held photocopies of documents. Passports from different nations, each with Daniel's face under new names. Some bore seals from Eastern Europe, others from South America. Each was marked "Sample" in faint letters, but the weight of possibility pressed hard. Another box held nothing but city maps: Boston, New York, Washington. Each marked with red ink, circles drawn around transport hubs and government buildings. In the bottom corner of one map, a crude drawing of a key. Sylvia Heller leaned over his shoulder, her voice low. "This isn't random storage. This is staging, preparation." Rourke nodded, though his jaw tightened. He pulled the final box from the shelf. It contained a single object, a steel case, locked, edges dented from use. He lifted the brass key, tried it, but the grooves did not match. Forensics would have to open it later. For now, it sat heavy, promise and threat in equal measure. Outside, the wind had risen, rain striking the pavement in sharp needles. Marianne arrived on the scene against advice, her face pale under the fluorescent glow. She demanded to see the unit, demanded to know what her brother had done. Rourke blocked her path gently, telling her only that evidence had been recovered. Her eyes filled with disbelief, but she said nothing, only staring past him at the rows of silent metal doors. The unit was sealed, catalogued, and locked again under police authority. Yet the image lingered, the shelves, the boxes, the chair, the maps. An entire shadow life constructed and abandoned. In his report, Rourke wrote, "Storage unit recovered under alias. Contents include multiple false documents, maps with targeted markings. Secured steel case, brass key confirmed as functional match to unit lock." But off the record, in the solitude of his desk, he noted a deeper line. Each door the key opens leads to another, darker one. The warehouse opens, dust swallowing secrets stored within. The storage unit was transferred to an evidence hangar, where the steel case lay on a long table under fluorescent light. Its dented edges caught the glow like scars. Forensics pried it open with steady hands, tools sliding against stubborn locks until the lid cracked with a metallic sigh. Inside, beneath layers of cloth, sat a stack of old envelopes, a bundle of audio cassettes, and one small case no bigger than a shoebox. When lifted, the weight was unexpected, dense, metallic, rattling faintly. Rourke set it down, unlatched the top, and peeled back the lining. A reel of microfilm gleamed under the lamp. Its spooled surface reflected pinpoints of light, unreadable yet full of threat. Alongside it, folded maps bore stamps long since retired. Government seals, redacted codes. Some pages were marked with clearance levels, others bore hand-drawn notations in Daniel's writing. Lines of numbers, brief words in shorthand, and in the corner of one map, the outline of a brass key scratched in ink. The cassettes offered only fragments when played. Muffled voices, distant city sounds, coded phrases in English and French. A clock chimed faintly in one recording. In another, static consumed the middle before a single phrase broke through. "The door is open." The lab confirmed the voices could include Daniel's, but the distortion left it unproven. Rourke stood over the table, the weight of the discovery pressing down. This was not the life of a man who disappeared by chance. This was architecture, deliberate and careful. Federal agents swarmed in, their gloves snapping, their files thick with blacked-out paragraphs. Agent Trovick spoke of jurisdiction, of classified intersections. "This moves beyond city lines," he said. Rourke held his silence but kept his notes. He refused to let the case vanish into redaction. He met with Sylvia Heller that evening. She sat with the microfilm unspooled under a viewer, eyes scanning flickering frames. "Coordinates," she murmured. "Old shipping routes, communications grids, maybe both. And here," she pointed to a frame marked with a faint symbol, the brass key again, drawn like a signature. He signed his work. Rourke carried the thought back to his office. The evidence board had grown thick, paper layered over paper, but the key remained at its center. Each object pointed back: the postcard sketch, the notebook drawings, the receipt image, the cafe photograph, the storage maps, and now the microfilm. Marianne was summoned to identify items. Her hands shook when she saw the cassettes, recognizing her brother's handwriting on the labels. "This isn't Daniel," she whispered. "He hated secrets. He hated lies." She looked at the key sketched on the maps and covered her mouth as though silencing words she couldn't say aloud. In his nightly report, Rourke wrote, "Microfilm recovered containing coded data, possibly maps or grids. Audio tapes contain muffled voice, potentially subject. Artifacts marked with recurring key symbol. Subject's life aligns with deliberate operational structure. Status unresolved." The words did not capture the unease. For every artifact uncovered, the meaning retreated. The key, once mundane, had become a cipher through which Daniel's double life announced itself. Yet no lock had explained what it opened. Late at night, alone in the evidence hangar, Rourke stood over the sealed boxes. Dust hung in the air, machines hummed faintly. He imagined Daniel seated in that folding chair, mapping routes, recording tapes, sketching keys into margins. Not a man lost, but a man building something. The thought chilled more than absence ever could. Microfilm glints, stamped with redacted clearance codes. The investigation closed like a door in slow motion. Files thickened, then disappeared into federal custody. Detectives were told to stand down, their reports reduced to footnotes. The city's missing person docket listed Daniel Kessler as unresolved, but in the background his name echoed through corridors Rourke was never allowed to walk. The final report reached him weeks later. It was sanitized, trimmed of weight. Subject presumed voluntary disappearance. Possible foreign connection. No body recovered. The words stripped the case of its blood, leaving only a shell. What lingered most was not the absence of a man, but the trail of objects he had left behind. The brass key rested now in the evidence locker, sealed in its plastic pouch. It had turned doors both known and unknown. The East Boston apartment, the storage unit, the locks that gave way to shelves of maps and false documents. Yet still it held grooves that fit nothing else, a pattern unfinished. Marianne came one last time to the precinct. She asked to see the artifacts. Regulations allowed her only a glimpse through glass. The notebooks, the postcard, the storage maps, the cassettes. Her eyes fixed on the key more than anything. She whispered that Daniel had drawn it since childhood, that no one ever knew why. Her hand pressed to the glass as though it might warm the metal through layers of air. Rourke walked her out into the late autumn dusk. The city moved as always. Buses groaning past, shop fronts closing, streetlights flickering on. For her, nothing was the same. She carried absence like a weight strapped across her chest. The federal presence faded in weeks, but not entirely. Now and then, Rourke glimpsed suits outside the courthouse, the kind that avoided eye contact. Files marked with Daniel's alias surfaced in whispers, only to vanish again. It was never spoken outright, but the message was plain. Part of the network was exposed, but deeper layers remained sealed. In the quiet of his office, Rourke rewound the cassettes, letting the static wash the room. Each fragment carried Daniel's shadow. A cough, a chair scraping, the faint phrase, "The door is open." The detective closed his eyes and pictured the man stepping into rain, overcoat drawn tight, key cold in his hand. His final notes, written in a narrow hand across the last page of his ledger, did not follow official form. The investigation is not solved. It is buried. The key remains. A life split between names, between doors, between shadows. The man is gone, but the locks still wait. The box was shut, the shelves sealed. The brass key placed among evidence too ordinary to matter and too strange to release. Outside, winter pressed against the harbor, waves breaking against the pier where a blurred photograph had once caught Daniel's profile beside an unnamed woman. The water closed over itself, leaving no trace. The brass key rests sealed, its lock never found.